AfriSam had the opportunity to host previous Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, as well as Dr Azar Jammine from Econometrix. So Dr Azar outlined the global economy, obviously the impact of what we're seeing playing out in Russia and the Ukraine and what that means from a global economic perspective. Then he zoomed into the South African economy and gave us a breakdown of what Minister Godongwana shared in the budget breakfast. And then lastly, zoomed into what the implications are for the construction industry in terms of infrastructure spend. So those were basically the three topics that were dealt with. And in between we had former Minister Trevor Manuel make some comments around efficacy in government and the various departments, also giving his insight as previous Finance Minister around the detail of how these budgets work and how people need to analyze them. So it was very insightful to have the two of them here. Previously we've had large amounts made available in the budget speech for infrastructure spend. But sadly and unfortunately, we haven't seen the execution of many of these. We are seeing a collapse in infrastructure. We're seeing water shortages. I think Trevor Manuel referred to Gqeberha, where we are seeing issues with water and sanitation. And that's, I think, the unfortunate reality of where we are as a country. We have a skill shortage. We've seen a collapse of the construction industry, the big companies like Group 5, Murray & Roberts. Now we're seeing Wilson Bailey Homes as well, where things aren't looking that positive. And, so that is largely because of the lack of actual infrastructure spend that has caused these companies to find themselves where they are.
The advantage of looking at all kinds of infrastructure investment is that you can track the lead time. Most infrastructure projects requires things like the acquisition of land for service. It requires adequate planning. It requires putting it out to tender. I think it's frequently impossible to do this with a lead time that's shorter than 3 years before the kind of equipment is on site, and that I think is the worrying thing for me, because we tend to follow the announcements, but the announcements come before that 3-year lead, and it's this issue that we've got to raise differently. The person responsible for infrastructure development in the presidency now, Dr Josienso Ramakgopa, is very focused on these kinds of issues, and I'm hoping that we can have discussions about both shortening that time frame and also ensuring that the concrete is turned more quickly and that infrastructure is developed. Again, I mentioned this morning that there are particular kinds of issues that require urgent attention, and one of those is water. And though I mentioned the Eastern Cape, it's not an exclusively Eastern Cape issue. Similarly, I think that we underspend on all kinds of infrastructure, roads and bridges, and even our energy infrastructure we underspend on. And when we do spend, we overspend. And so I think that we need takeouts from what happened at Kusile and Medupi, and understand that no country can spend on that basis. You have to build in the efficiencies of spending and ensure that it's not just infrastructure spend, but it's efficient infrastructure spend, because it's that that will create employment and provide the economic outputs from the infrastructure spend.
I think it's a very important question that you ask as to whether or not government will actually be able to implement its investment projects. Historically, it has failed to do so, and we see that the construction sector has actually been the slowest growing sector of all in the South African economy over the past decade, and many of the skills and resources have left the country because of no work, despite the fact that the government has ostensibly promised to invest more. This time round I am a little more optimistic because the government has set out specific projects, a series. There were in 2020 the announcement in the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Program of 51 projects worth 340 billion rand, and in the November 2021 medium-term budget policy statement a commitment to spending another 595 billion rand on 55 well-defined projects. If only a small fraction of those projects actually see the light of day, that will still have an enormous impact in boosting overall capital investment and improving the delivery of services in South Africa. To put it in perspective, 935 billion rand worth of pipeline of investment projects is equivalent to 126% of annual total fixed investment in the country, which, even if it's spread out over 10 years, it still amounts to a 12.5% annual increase in capital investment, which in turn would boost economic growth by 2% per annum and see the creation of hundreds of thousands of new jobs. One can only hope that that materializes. It's the most important and relevant potential game changer in the South African economy.
And I think, again, and I keep referring to him, but he's made some useful insights. Former Minister Trevor Manuel did say that there are roles that the private sector has played. I mean, one of them was the Solidarity Fund that he referred to. And I believe that if government and the private sector could work more closely together, I think the other reference that was made to in the presentation was former President Thabo Mbeki questioning government and asking them why they do not engage more with the private sector. I think what we would like to see is a re-establishment of trust between government and the private sector. There is a lot of potential, there is a lot of ability within the private sector to help boost our infrastructure spend, to help boost our economy, but we do need some certainty around policy. I mean, there are a lot of policy uncertainty still, one of them being the land expropriation one. We need some finalization on some of these policies because there is a willingness from the private sector to invest and to spend, but for that to happen we need policy certainty and we need a re-establishment of trust between government and the private sector.
I'm hoping that before we can even talk about the private sector, we can transcend this notion that the private sector is a problem. It's fundamentally important. I think that the way in which the Minister Minister of Finance argued these issues in the budget speech will help us understand this going forward. Add that to the message from the President in the SONA that it's the private sector that creates employment, and of course it's the correct point. As those ideas find resonance in the general discourse, I'm hoping that government and the private sector can then sit down and talk about this, focus on the planning, focus on the implementation, and focus on the outcomes. A voice about the budget that was tabled this week is, we get very excited when numbers are announced, and nobody bothers about what happens later when the money has or has not been spent. And hopefully we can change that as well, and use this moment now when we're reflecting on this year's budget to ask about what happened in last year's budget. Because if we don't know what happened with the money last year, we will never be able to correct, we will never be able to get the infrastructure right, we'll never be able to improve on the quality of life of people.
Well, more generally, what seems to have improved is the relationship between the private sector and the government in terms of cooperating to implement such projects. I believe that the government itself has experienced a sea change in the last year or so in terms of wanting to embrace the private sector more actively to assist it in implementing projects. The government has come to recognize that it itself is not capable of carrying through with these projects on its own, and it was one of the most forceful aspects of the State of the Nation address of President Ramaphosa when he said it's the private sector that creates jobs, not the government. What the private sector must now do is to try and engage government more actively, because theoretically it should receive a far better reception than has been the case in the past, and with its superior skills should be able to actually ensure more work for itself and more success in actually improving the overall state of the economy and service delivery.